Hey guys, Jake here, and today I want to talk about racing game soundtracks because ever since Need for Speed Unbound released back in November about the Palace Edition, I've been hearing a lot of criticism for its soundtrack. A lot of people have very mixed opinions on it, and it's led to a lot of discussion over how racing game soundtracks have changed, over how music has changed over the past 15-20 years, and much more, and I find it to be quite an interesting topic. Now, I think this video is going to be more so aimed for the people that don't like these new racing game soundtracks. I actually don't think they all suck, and I actually like plenty of Unbound soundtrack, and that's why I want to talk about this today. I don't want to be one-sided, one way or the other, like saying one is bad or one is good, but I more so want to explain the phenomenon of why you may not like Need for Speed Unbound or Need for Speed Heat soundtrack, for example. And before I start, I'm going to show some racing games on the screen, and these are racing games with my favorite soundtracks in them, just so you can get some context for my music taste in racing games for this video. So I want to start with the fact that what I've noticed with all this soundtrack bashing and discussion lately is the fact that most of the time, because it's obviously Need for Speed Unbound soundtrack that's getting a lot of attention, usually when we're thinking about good racing game soundtracks and what it's compared to is games like Need for Speed Underground 1, 2, and most wanted 2005. Need for Speed Pro Straight's also a common contender as well, because those games featured a bigger variety of music that was popular at the time. And while I like plenty of Unbound soundtrack, I can't deny that this is true. Some games skewed a little bit heavily toward one thing or the other, but most of the time you had a pretty good mix of rap, rock, and a bit of electronic as well. This is what Need for Speed had going in it for quite a long time, and I think that variety stopped up until Need for Speed Heat. I think this happened because rock music hasn't been as popular in mainstream music and just culture in the past 5-10 years. Now, you may have heard a lot of rock music, but it's either old rock songs or it's old bands making new songs. Now, I think that circles back around to another point, which is personal taste. I watched this video on YouTube lately called Racing Games Used to Rock, and that is partially what inspired me to make this video, is because one of the things that was mentioned in that video was how the creator mainly listened to Need for Speed soundtracks on shuffle, instead of going on Spotify and finding music from there and such. And I think this makes a huge difference because of my own experience. I used to be one of those people that mainly listened to Need for Speed soundtracks. It's where a lot of my music taste growing up came from, and I imagine it's the same for a lot of my viewers. And my opinion on that hasn't changed. Need for Speed has had a lot of fantastic soundtracks. So I'm still a big fan of a lot of music from Need for Speed, and I found a lot of great artists from the franchise. But what is this personal experience exactly? For me, it's when I started going on Spotify and finding some of my favorite songs, so like Watercolor by Pendulum from Need for Speed Hot Pursuit. I went and listened to the entire album that song came from. This is how I started expanding my music taste a lot more. And of course, you're going to be listening to the same bands or artists, but a lot of times there will be featured artists that you like to go and look at afterwards, and you just get more of a taste of what music that you already like has to offer. And over time from there, I just started finding a lot more stuff. And this is where I realized an interesting aspect of things. When I mentioned the scope of new or old rock bands and stuff like that in these new games and in mainstream music and popular culture in general, it's where I started to notice that a lot of Need for Speed fans that tend to always go back to this old music don't really know much about the music of today when it comes to some of their favorite artists or genres and stuff like that, but they mainly stick to the stuff that they already know. That's not any kind of insult, but it's just kind of the case. And the video that I watched earlier said that exact same thing. And when you don't know a lot of new music or stuff in general outside of soundtracks that you already know, you don't know the full scope and the full world of music that's actually out there. Therefore, it's easy to make an opinion that if you don't like what's on a current soundtrack or a new soundtrack, it means that music might just be worse now. But I don't really think that's the case for the most part. There's a lot of factors that play into all the criticism and dislike of Need for Speed Unbound soundtrack from particular fans. There's less variety because of what I mentioned about rock music earlier, and the fact that Need for Speed for the past 2 games has wanted to make a hip-hop inspired game. I mean, look at Unbound's general aesthetic and look. With the graffiti and everything, this game was meant to have a hip-hop style soundtrack. And they tried to add variety in the sense that they tried to go from all over the world, find all kinds of artists, which is why you see a lot of people saying that they don't know a lot of artists in the game is because of how worldwide they went. If you live in the US, you're probably not going to know any names of any Ukrainian hip-hop acts, for example. So while they wanted to keep it to one genre, they wanted to add diversity in a very different way than we usually see. And I'm not saying that the soundtrack is excellent or amazing or anything, but I think it has plenty of good picks. However, another issue with it is that there's no way to turn certain songs off. There's plenty of times where I end up turning off the music because there's 5 or 6 songs, or just a few that I particularly really hate. Even though there's more that I think are just okay or that I like quite a bit than those tracks. But clearly going for one genre of music is upsetting a lot of Need for Speed fans, so honestly, even with the creative direction, I don't think they should do something like this again. However, with some of the fans of these previous soundtracks and discussions I've had, one thing I've actually noticed is that there are other racing games that have had a lack of diversity that no one complains about. And in particular, what I see that with is Burnout 3's soundtrack. Now, if you don't know me too well, I really dislike Burnout 3's soundtrack. I know that's a crime to a lot of racing game fans, but it's the thing I like least about the game. I think Revenge's soundtrack is a million times better. But I've seen statements not complaining about the lack of diversity in this game's soundtrack. Why is that exactly? Because the majority of people complaining about Unbound soundtrack are people who are fans of rock and want to see it in Need for Speed and other racing games again. Of course, rock fans aren't going to complain about a rock-filled soundtrack. And I think the difference here is that rock isn't my main genre or a genre that I listen to a lot, and that usually when I do like rock, it tends to be heavier rock or something metal-esque. But Burnout 3 is full of pop punk, and for me, after a while, Burnout 3 soundtrack starts to sound like nails on a chalkboard. I think most of the individual songs are fine, but it's the fact that there's just so much of one thing and so little diversity, it just makes it sound so one note and repetitive to me that I get sick of it. And I imagine this is how plenty of people feel about Unbound soundtrack, but just about hip hop instead of rock. But I even saw someone claim that Burnout 3 had diversity in rock, and never mind the fact that that's still not making it diverse via genres, you still only have one genre. Burnout 3 wasn't even diverse in its rock selection either. There was like one metal song, one rap rock song, and the rest of it felt like pop punk. Again, to me, nails on a chalkboard. I still hate it, and you can't change that about me, and I would still love to be able to play Revenge's soundtrack inside of the game, but it is what it is. But overall, I think it's the many rock fans that earlier Need for Speed games have created that have made people dislike Heat and Unbound soundtrack so much, particularly those vocal fans. And since Need for Speed is completely changing up its style of music in the past couple games, I think there's a lot of people that are resistant to that change and not a fan of what they're currently offering. Anyways, I want to talk about that. I think the kind of one-note soundtrack bashing on Unbound is getting a little bit old to me. In fact, discussion of it to me in general is getting a little bit old because people just tend to point out the same 5 songs and ignore the rest of the good ones and say the whole soundtrack's trash. It's not something that I really understand, just in my opinion, but that's the way I think. A lot of people are going to disagree with me about Burnout 3 soundtrack, for example. But I felt like this was a good opportunity to have a discussion about soundtracks and racing games and how they've changed and how people can stick to their old taste and how that affects their view on new soundtracks and music in general. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys later.